Bienvenidos y bienvenidas a esta tercera entrega de nuestras entrevistas antifascistas de la Marea, un especial que llevamos ya unas semanas con varios encuentros con personas que se dedican a investigar, analizar y a combatir el odio y a la extrema derecha. Hoy tenemos el placer de tener a Andrew Marantz, que ha venido directamente desde Nueva York, Estados Unidos, a participar en el Foro de las Culturas en Valladolid y que, aprovechando su visita a Madrid, pues nos hemos reunido aquí para hablar de su magnífico libro, Antisocial, la extrema derecha y la libertad de expresión en Internet. Un magnífico trabajo de análisis, de investigación sobre la alt-right, editado por Capitán Swing en castellano, y que hoy pues tenemos el placer de tener a su autor con nosotros. Bienvenido, Andrew, ha sido un placer encontrarte y nada, vamos a charlar contigo un rato sobre tu trabajo y también sobre lo que nos depara el futuro, porque los movimientos de extrema derecha, el odio, no desaparece, sino que se transforma, ¿no? Como la energía. Pues para empezar con lo más básico, para entender no solo tu trabajo, sino lo que queremos investigar hoy aquí en esta entrevista, ¿qué es la alt-right? ¿Dónde nace la alt-right?
So there's a way of defining the alt-right that, we could start in 2014 or 2015, or there's a way of defining it where you could start thousands of years ago, right? Because hate and misinformation and xenophobia, these things were not invented by the internet. These things existed long before there was an internet. The challenge, though, is when these very sort of basic human proclivities or human emotions come into contact with a new system of distributing information, right? So around 2014 or 2015, I and some other journalists and people started noticing that a lot of things that were formerly very fringe ideas were suddenly starting to be propelled into the mainstream of American discourse. So hatred, prejudice, anti-Semitism, misogyny, racism, sometimes a little bit masked or hidden, sometimes not. These were things that, again, were not new ideologies, right? In many ways, the United States was founded on these ideologies in addition to others, but that there was a period, let's say in the middle of the 20th century, where it was impolite to say these things broadly in society or to build a political movement around them. And there was this understanding that if you built a political movement on open racism or open bigotry, it just wouldn't work. You would lose, some sort of mythical center of the country. And then the alt-right was kind of an attempt to say, well, what if you just tried a really raw base, essentially white male identity politics? And for a variety of reasons, including how information spreads on the internet, it was much more powerful than many people thought it would be. And so you started to see, again, these formerly marginal, these formerly fringe ideologies gaining a lot of traction. And you could measure it statistically because the internet puts numbers on everything. So on social media, you could see when you said something like, I don't want to play a video game that was made by a woman, or whatever, pick any example you want, you could just see in the marketplace of ideas, well, how many numbers does it rack up? And it turns out often quite a lot. And so in short, the alt-right was a very old ideology dressed up as something new. And it was sort of, in English, it was supposed to be alternative right. It was supposed to be an alternative to the mainstream conservative politics that we had in the United States at the time. And very quickly, it migrated from the alternative to the mainstream. It essentially took over the right half of the political spectrum. And now it's become so normalized that we hardly even see it anymore, even though it's actually quite dominant.
¿Qué papel tuvo Donald Trump en la normalización de la alt-right y los medios de comunicación afines?
There's responsibility in both directions. So I think that Donald Trump helped the alt-right and the alt-right helped Donald Trump. I think, Donald Trump helped media and the media helped Donald Trump. So these relationships are always transactional and they're always a little bit uncomfortable. And for my part, part of the thing that's uncomfortable for me to admit, but that I think is worth taking seriously, is that I also sometimes have more of a transactional relationship with these people than I would like to admit. I mean, I like to think, oh, I'm just investigating and uncovering all the bad things that people are doing on the internet, and that is true, but there's also a sense in which, you know, a lot of these people want me to expose them because they want any attention, even negative attention. And so that's something we can talk about. I try to be as ethically responsible and thoughtful about that as I can, but it's just something that I have to wrestle with as a dynamic. But with Trump, you know, I don't think he was wrestling with that. I think he was just, all attention is good attention. And really, you know, that sort of old saying, there's no such thing as bad press, he really just put that to his advantage. And he just, when he was asked about something, he would just sort of, you know, try to dance away from it. So if somebody said, oh, David Duke is endorsing your campaign, or, you know, the people at Charlottesville say that they're fans of yours or whatever, he would just say, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what that means. And it wasn't true, but, you know, he was just a forceful and sort of weirdly charismatic enough presence that he was able to skate by. Now, there were still things that ultimately were distractions or liabilities for him. And look, it's not like that's the only way to gain attention. It was just his way. And it turns out that, you know, social media rewards anything really shocking, really engaging, anything that gets your heart pumping a lot. So it wasn't that Donald Trump himself was like a really good computer coder or that he understood the internet in some deep way. He just had an instinctive understanding that really went back to, you know, tabloid newspapers in the 70s and 80s, that if you're really shocking and if you keep doing things that people can't believe and that they can't take their eyes off of, then you'll keep getting more attention. And yeah, maybe it'll hurt your reputation or your dignity or your pride, but he didn't really seem to care about any of those things.
El libro se publicó antes de que Trump perdiera las elecciones y, por lo tanto, antes del asalto al Capitolio. ¿Qué papel tuvo la alt-right en el asalto del Capitolio y qué se está viendo ahora con la investigación? Recientemente se publicó una supuesta relación entre algún mando de la policía con miembros de Proud Boys. ¿Y qué se está dilucidando ahora con la investigación?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, like we were saying before, a lot of this stuff, it's shocking when it first happens and then it becomes normalized and then it just sort of fades into the background. So a lot of things that I would see in 2015 that would seem unbelievably shocking or new, now they just happen all the time. So, you know, if somebody, you know, tried to run for president based on a platform of, you know, there's a global conspiracy run by cosmopolitan elites that are secretly controlling the world, that was really surprising in 2015 and 2016. Now, that's just a common talking point that, you know, all sorts of politicians say, and it's not some shocking, vulgar thing that only Donald Trump is willing to say. So I think part of what changed from, let's say, the 2016 election to the 2020 election is that some of these things became so normalized that the fact that they happen all the time was just less noticed. Now, you know, the summer and fall of 2020 were very volatile, shocking periods in American history. And so there are many factors obviously explaining that, the COVID lockdown, the Black Lives Matter protests, and there was a lot of material that people could use to spin up fear and insecurity. And at the end of the day, you know, Trump wasn't able to win that election, but I don't think it necessarily means that, you know, this was just a one-time fluke thing. You know, I think the 2016 election easily could have gone the other way. The 2020 election easily could have gone the other way. We're just sort of stuck in the US, and there are similar situations in other countries different but similar, where every election is kind of like a coin toss. I mean, you can sway it one way or the other way, but the basic formation that you have, an authoritarian leaning bloc, a progressive leaning bloc, and a lot of stuff in the middle, that essential dynamic doesn't go anywhere. So to more specifically to your question, the formations that I was investigating, in Donald Trump's first inauguration, I was in the streets with the Proud Boys, watching them getting into street fights and fighting their way into the building and having these big, parties celebrating their own sort of their own sort of orgy of sort of celebratory violence, basically. And the formation of that change, the form of that changed, the sort of superficial nature of it changed, but the underlying structure doesn't go anywhere. You have these impulses to have people, fight for their identity or fight for their homeland, however they perceive that. That doesn't change. The name of the groups might change, the way they present themselves might change, the uniform might change. That's all based on political expediency, but the underlying impulse doesn't go away, because there's always this impulse, I think, in certain segments of society or the media to say, oh wow, that was such a weird moment, glad that's over. And you'll probably see that, like, let's say if Trump doesn't win the nomination in 2024, you'll probably see a lot of people all over the world sort of breathing a sigh of relief and saying, okay, that's over, that chapter of our history is closed. But I think if you look at any of this stuff carefully, it's not one person or a dozen people or a dozen groups of people that are the issue. The issue is underlying and structural.
¿Se han tomado en serio las autoridades, sobre todo a raíz del asalto al Capitolio, la amenaza que supone ya no solo para la normalización de los discursos de odio, como ha conseguido la alt-right y Donald Trump, sino para las propias instituciones y la propia democracia, la existencia, la persistencia y la impunidad en muchos casos de estos grupos?
I think some people take it seriously. I think it could be taken more seriously. You see, I mean, when we were watching the January 6th assault on the Capitol in real time, there was obviously a ton of video because people were streaming it. They were showing it live themselves, the people who were doing it. And a lot of times you could see, police officers taking selfies with them or letting them in or, not trying to stop them. I don't know that was taken seriously enough at the time because it was a difficult narrative for most Americans to accept, that there could really be kind of insurrectionist sympathizers within the security forces. I think when you see it in Brazil, that's accepted very readily. I mean, you had Lula coming out the next day and saying, we're going to get rid of the sympathizers within the security forces. And that was just something that you do because you have recent experience in your country with how to deal with stopping a coup. That sort of vocabulary and that instinct doesn't really exist in the American context. The American style of dealing with this stuff is to really say, well, this is not who we are, and we Americans, we're better than this, and we would never do something like this. So even when you see video of American police forces doing something like that, there are a lot of Americans who don't want to see it, or they find a way to explain around it, or so I think that January 6th, I think the whole that whole incident and everything leading to it and the final analysis of what it meant still hasn't really been fully digested by the American public or even by America's leaders, because yes, we can condemn it and say it's really bad to try to overthrow an election and we don't like destruction of, property or whatever, but the real full meaning of it, how it was able to get as far as it was, or even whether to take it seriously, I think has not fully penetrated into the discourse. You're still stuck at this very superficial level of, well, they weren't able to overthrow the government, so let's forget it. Let's turn the page. Or, on the other hand, you have some people saying, they really almost had a coup and they're going to have a coup next time, which I think is also a bit of a jumping to a conclusion. It was a very serious event, but I don't think it was serious because it was going to work. I think it was serious because of, again, the underlying currents and desires and ideological methods that it represented. And so, yeah, I mean, to your point, there are many connections. There are people in Congress who have expressed sympathies very openly with the people who were rioting in the Capitol. I don't know, that doesn't require investigation. That's just them saying it. The question is then, what do you do with that information? You have elected members of Congress who, whether sincerely or just to score points, are expressing sympathy with people who are trying to stop a democratic election. I don't really know what to do with that information other than hope that that's not a winning political strategy. But in certain districts and certain parties, it is. So this is one of the paradoxes of democracy, right? You have democratic elections where people can continue to be reelected with an anti-democratic platform. That's pretty messed up, and that's just a really big puzzle. It literally is a paradox for democracy. I don't want, I want the winner of a democratic election to be seated, but I also think it's pretty dangerous when you have a government full of people who want that government not to continue to exist.
Recientemente se ha aprobado una ley en Florida que está provocando la retirada de varios libros con contenidos LGTBI, sobre temas de género, sobre la teoría crítica de la raza. Recientemente también estamos viendo numerosas manifestaciones de grupos neonazis y fascistas como los Proud Boys contra actos LGTBI en varias ciudades de Estados Unidos. También las leyes del aborto en Estados Unidos pues han dado marcha atrás recientemente. Sin embargo, lo que nos llega aquí demasiadas veces es que existe una supuesta teoría de la cancelación que está tratando de censurar cierta incorrección política, como les gusta llamarse a ellos, ¿no? Cuando pues, están difundiendo discurso de odio, machista, racista, homófobo, ¿no? Incluso defendiendo una interpretación de la historia pues, basada en cierto supremacismo, ¿no? ¿Qué hay de cierta en la cultura de la cancelación, o dónde está la cultura de la cancelación en Estados Unidos?
Yeah, I think I appreciate the framing of the question. It's not the way you usually hear the question framed in the American media, but I think it's totally legitimate, right? There has been this very successful association that certain people have made, I think, on purpose, between, cancel culture and the left, or, the censorious left, or the people who want to censor you and tell you what to say, are coming from, woke college students. The law in Florida is called the Stop Woke Act. And this is, obviously Ron DeSantis, who, seems to want to run for president in Trump's legacy, is clearly seeing this as a political tool that he can use to say, the woke people want to silence you and I'm going to be your champion. When, of course, the law itself is a much greater threat to free speech than anything that some high school student is saying, right? So this is one of these times where the narrative has really outpaced the facts. Is there someone somewhere who is, trying to cancel somebody from the left? Maybe that exists. I mean, I'm sure that there are examples of somebody on Twitter yelling at somebody and saying, you can't say that because it offends me. But the much greater threat in terms of, force, the force of the law, statistically, numerically, the greater threat comes from people like the governor of Florida who want to use the law to silence people. I mean, seems to me, we'll see what happens in the courts because it's being challenged right now, but it seems to me that that law just clearly violates the Constitution. that is the state using its power to ban books from the classroom. That is a classic violation of the First Amendment. If there's anything that is cancel culture or needing a safe space from ideas that offend you, that's a perfect example of it. And yeah, you can go down the line, you know, other places where you're not allowed to, there are laws against BDS, the boycott, divestment, and settlement and sanctions movement. There are places where, according to American law, you're not allowed to support Palestinians who want to boycott Israeli goods. That seems like a clear violation of free speech to me, and that's coming from the right. But because of the narrative that the left is the woke, censorious faction within American politics, somehow those censorious actions from the right don't get associated or don't get remembered, or they don't fit into the narrative, so they somehow get forgotten. So, look, I think it's great to stand up for freedom of speech. It would just be nice if people did it a little bit more consistently, and especially if they did it with more of an eye toward what the government is doing. Of course, I think it's annoying when somebody is shouting on social media in a way that I think is superficial, but it's not the same as the government banning a book. They have different weights and different impacts.
En Europa tenemos una histórica controversia sobre los límites de la libertad de expresión, ¿no? Aquí, por ejemplo, en el Estado español tenemos a gente que hace música, raperos, que están en prisión por criticar a la monarquía o a la policía, ¿no? Y, sin embargo, están permitidas las expresiones de apología del nazismo, del fascismo, aunque haya leyes que se supone que las prohíben, ¿no? Esta concepción de esta libertad de expresión absoluta, que tú además planteas en el título del libro, como además una puerta abierta también para que los discursos de odio tengan esa legitimidad, ¿no? Como ideas respetables, nos provoca en Europa ciertas dudas sobre dónde puede haber límites y si debe haber límites a esta libertad de expresión. Viniendo de Estados Unidos, pero conociendo también este debate que existe en Europa, también recordar que en Europa pues, hemos sufrido el Holocausto, ¿no? Hemos sufrido aquí una dictadura fascista, ¿no? Pues posiblemente también esto tenga algo que ver, ¿no? Pues sobre estos límites. Lamentablemente, muchas de estas leyes que se supone que combaten los discursos de odio, demasiadas veces acaban censurando a quienes combaten el discurso de odio o son críticos con el poder. Y tenemos siempre esta controversia sobre los límites de la libertad de expresión y si debería haber algún límite o no.
Sí, entiendo las dudas totalmente. I mean, I understand why people are afraid of these limits, and I understand the controversy. I think it's really difficult to get right. And so I think it's okay that there's a different legal context in an American context and in a European context. And I think it does have to do with how we understand the history of fascism. I don't think that the United States is immune to fascism, obviously. That's part of why I wrote this book. But I think it has a different history with regard to it and how recent it's been and everything. So, look, there are a lot of parts of the sort of traditional American interpretation of constitutional law that I might quibble with. But I do have, I guess, a bias just coming from where I come from toward saying that there's a line between what the government can do to restrict speech and what private companies or private citizens can do. And that's just sort of the way I'm used to thinking of it. I can appreciate places where there might be reasons to change that legal regime or make exceptions to it, and I can understand those arguments. And I think it's worthwhile for more Americans to engage with those arguments and to think about ways that there might be different legal regimes that could make sense. But from where we are now in an American context, you know, we don't have laws against Holocaust denial, for example. In Germany you do, in Israel you do, in France you do, but there's no... Is there a law in Spain that you're not allowed to say that the Holocaust didn't happen?
It's allowed.
Yeah, it's allowed.
Es legal negar el Holocausto, aunque en el Código Penal existe una figura que se supone que penaliza la denigración de las víctimas y la apología del genocidio, pero es ambigua, porque aquí hemos visto, aquí, en el cementerio de la Almudena, aquí mismo hemos visto un homenaje a los voluntarios españoles que combatieron por Hitler, y no ha habido sanción.
Really?
In few meters.
Wow.
Entonces, la ley existe, la manera de aplicarla es otra cosa.
It's the same. It's the same in the United States. You can have the law and then you can have the way it's applied. So my personal preference is I am comfortable with the law, the state, not stepping in and banning most kinds of speech. It's never 100% because there are kinds of speech that the state does prohibit, child pornography or blackmail or bribery or whatever. But you know, I'm okay with a legal regime that says we're not going to criminally punish you if you say, you know, something in support of the Nazis. We're not going to criminally punish you if you use hate speech. There are no, you know, laws against hate speech in the United States, or the standard is extremely high. There has to be a clear and present danger of inciting violence. So, you know, according to the law, this is the way it currently stands. You know, I can't say, I want you to go hurt that person right now, but I can say, you know, the Nazis were good or something. Now, but I think where people get confused is when they say, okay, we don't want to have laws against this, so therefore we don't want Facebook to make a rule about it, or we don't want Elon Musk to make a rule about it, right? Or we don't want the incentives of the internet to stop promoting it. So I think it's perfectly consistent. In fact, I think it's like the only position that makes sense, personally, to say, okay, I don't want Donald Trump's government telling me what I can say, but I do want Mark Zuckerberg to make a rule saying you can't be a Nazi on Facebook. Those things don't seem inconsistent to me at all. And the fact that the discourse has been weaponized so that one thing is interchangeable with the other thing, I think is just disingenuous. Obviously, it's difficult. Social media has become very powerful. It's become kind of a quasi, you know, public square. And so we need to think through these things carefully. And obviously, I don't want Mark Zuckerberg to be in control of my life. You know, I don't trust his motives. I don't, you know, it's not like I just want to hand over all my rights to some billionaire. But there is a real distinction between somebody telling me I don't get amplified algorithmically on their private company platform and the government putting me in jail.
Okay. Hay una parte del libro en el que habla sobre periodismo, sobre el papel de los y las periodistas, y la subrayé y quisiera leer un par de frases y comentarlas contigo porque me resultan bastante interesantes y además bastante recurrentes para aquellos periodistas que desde el principio admitimos que no somos neutrales. Dices que cuando se alude a cuestiones de principios fundamentales, no siempre es posible ser imparcial y honesto al mismo tiempo. La neutralidad nunca ha sido un bien universal, ni siquiera en épocas más sencillas. ¿Por qué a los periodistas se les considera neutrales y a los que os dicen abiertamente que en temas que afectan a los derechos fundamentales no lo son, se les tilda de activistas? ¿Esto pasa también en Estados Unidos?
Yeah, it's very similar. I think some parts of the media are starting to learn some of these lessons, but it's slow and gradual. I mean, there has been a very long period of training and enculturation, and you could even say indoctrination within the media that, you know, the most important thing is to be neutral and objective. And I guess what I am sort of trying to say in places like that, and others are saying this too now, is sure, it's great to be neutral and objective if that was the only thing in the world, if it just existed in a vacuum. But how does the value of objectivity, quote unquote, if that even is a real thing, how does that stack up against other values like respecting human rights and human dignity and fidelity to the truth? And when those things are in tension, you know, a lot of journalists kind of just become like robots that malfunction and, you know, just say, I just can't compute, you know. These are difficult calculations. And if, you know, I think part of the issue is that there's this tradition within journalism that, you know, you're not supposed to be a person with a brain. You're supposed to be some kind of vessel for, you know, objective facts. And there's this sort of very dry sort of newspaper tradition of, I don't have any opinions, I don't have any thoughts, I just saw what happened and I wrote it down. And that's always been a fiction, but I think it's becoming particularly galling and acute now that you can't, there is no one way to see the world, and if there is one way to see the world, this isn't it. Like, you can't go out into the world and tell me that the objective role of a journalist is to say, well, some people seem to really like authoritarianism and other people don't, and I'm going to quote both of them and give you one sentence from each side, and that's me doing my job. That's actually not a journalist doing their job. And so it, you know, I understand that I'm in a bit of a different role than some other journalists because I'm freer to say my opinions. I work in ways that are narrative and that where the, you know, my thoughts are kind of integrated into the text, and other people are not comfortable doing that. That's fine. I use the first person, some other people don't. That's also fine. But you can't just comfort yourself that, well, you know, I gave equal space to both sides, so my job here is done. You have to think a little bit harder than that. And I think if you can't see that after Donald Trump and Brexit and Modi and Netanyahu and, you know, Orban and on down the list, if you can't see that now, I don't know when you're going to see it.
A ti también te ha llamado activista, ¿verdad? Por hacer tu periodismo, estoy seguro.
I really just don't think that distinction makes that much sense, you know? If it makes me an activist to say, you know, the Proud Boy punching the woman on the street and the woman getting punched by the Proud Boy on the street are just both two sides, and I'll just quote both sides equally. If I think that's stupid,
Yeah.
and that makes me an activist, then okay, you know, me taking the side of the citizen getting punched in the street, I'll just have to live with that.
Pues ha sido un placer conversar contigo, Andrew, y la verdad es que es un placer también tenerte estos días por aquí. Recomendar, sin ninguna duda, el libro magnífico traducido por Capitán Swing y editado de nombre Antisocial, la extrema derecha y la libertad de expresión en Internet. Así que muchísimas gracias por tu tiempo, muchísimas gracias por tu trabajo y esperamos leerte una segunda parte con lo que tenga que pasar en las elecciones del año que viene y con todo lo que venga después. Muchísimas gracias por todo, Andrew.
Gracias.